Well, hello, and welcome to another episode of Pod of the Gaps, the podcast that tries to combine theology, philosophy, banter, an occasional bit of baking and craft activities on the side. Basically, if we can squeeze it onto a podcast, we'll squeeze it on this show. My name is Andy Bannister, and I'm joined by Eva as my partners in crime from the other end of the country, Aaron Edwards and Michael Lotz. How are you gents doing today?
Not too bad, thank you.
Not too bad.
Okay. Although I think the pollen count in Leicestershire has just skyrocketed because, my eyes and nose aren't doing what they should be doing.
That's right.
Yes, as for listeners who can't see, Michael in glorious high definitions, he's busy squeezing. Well, I hope it's eye drops. When you picked up the little bottle, it did almost look like super glue, which would have been a rather embarrassing mistake. Aaron, have you ever stuck super glue in your eyes?
Not intentionally, I did used to wake up when I was younger with that. Have you ever had that where you have the sleep that congeals?
Yes.
And then you wake up and you think you're blind, and then when you actually open them, it looks like a kind of opening of like a crocodile's mouth with all this kind of. It was absolutely. I don't think I was a child when that happened. It was quite traumatizing. So it's very weird. So when you finally do prise your eyes open to see this kind of weird, gloopy connection. But nothing. That's like super glue, but not quite.
Yeah. I confess I've never done super glue, but I did once manage to blow my eyebrows off when I was about 9 years old. So that's one of my claims to fame. Yeah, so a friend and I, when I was about 9, there were these little sort of a cap gun thing. So these little yellow plastic caps that you could put in and pull the trigger on the toy gun and go bang. And they had this little bit of black powder in each of them to make that happen. And so a friend and I, when I was about 9 years old, we had the entertaining idea of, well, why don't we buy a couple of thousand of these at the toy shop? And we spent an entire afternoon scraping out the black powder. And so we had a little pile. And then my friend saying to me, well, okay, this is great. How do we light it? And I went, I'll just use a match. And so I took a match, leant over and lit the black powder. There was a sort of loud bang and a sort of mushroom cloud of fire and whatnot, and with the result that I had singed one eyebrow and actually blown the other off.
That's amazing.
And I remember going home and sitting at the dinner table with like one hand like this at the table, so my mother wouldn't notice, and was like, elbows off the table, what are you doing? And then, closely followed by the question no mother ever wants to ask, where is your eyebrow?
That's amazing. That reminds me of my dad has a story. Talk about your mum. When he was about 10 or 11, I think, him and his friends growing up in Liverpool, they managed to play. They were playing a game on the top of a factory. They climbed up onto the roof of a rope factory, and they started playing a game. Let's set fire to this straw and see how big the fire can get before we get it out. So if you have a go and it gets like a certain big, then you stamp it out. And obviously, if you lose the game, everything goes wrong. And that's exactly what happened. They burned down an entire rope factory. And it was absolutely unbelievable. And then they ran away, but then they came back to watch the kind of flames, and then the whole neighborhood was there, and then obviously the four of them have singed eyebrows, and then that's how they had the police came round and they kind of got it got kind of done in for it. But it was back in the day when my dad was before a juvenile court as a result, as you'd expect. Wow. And this is back in the day when the judge was like, right, we're going to sentence you now, and my granddad was able to stand up in court and say, don't worry, judge, I'll sort him out. And he's like, all right, fair enough.
I thought you were going to say it's back in the days where he was transported to Australia, or
that's right. Yeah,
eyebrows. I don't know if I can top that story, but growing eyebrows back takes an incredibly long length of time. It's they're not particularly long, but
really,
I was on a youth camp once, and one of the young people did kind of that dare game where basically someone dared him to shave his eyebrows off. And in a youth camp, you kind of think these things are all incredibly cool, and so he did. But then, 2 months later at school, still with no eyebrows, it obviously wasn't quite so cool.
wasn't quite cool. Well, there is probably a really kind of weak and tenuous link.
I was waiting for this.
Change one's appearance.
Go on, do it.
So, I know, do it, Bannister, do it. To today's topic, because there was we were interrupted last week by the theme of sport. And it was very exciting, actually, recorded last week because Scotland were about to play some important matches, and they then lost spectacularly. We were on a mission to see if we could, again, get this podcast cancelled, and we briefly interrupted it to talk about sport. And now we're back onto the Can We Get Cancelled theme, because today we have, one of the big elephants in the room, one of the big questions that we've kind of danced around a bit on Pod of the Gaps, but haven't actually addressed, which is not why do Michael's eyebrows look the way they do. but is the whole question of transgender, which is kind of all over the place. And we try not to be particularly topical in terms of tying what we talk about on Polar the Gaps to things happening in the news right now, because we know these episodes have a long life. But it seems every day there's a story. And just a couple of days ago, as we were planning to record this episode, yet another big media splash that I think just throws light on so many of the questions and issues around transgender. It's the story of New Zealand have just announced that for their Olympic team at the Tokyo Olympics, for in the women's weightlifting, they have picked Laurel Hubbard. And who is Laurel Hubbard? Well, Laurel Hubbard was born a man. He was a man until 2012, which means had all of the benefits of testosterone and muscle mass and everything growing up. And so there was a huge outcry of going, what does this mean for women?
What could possibly go wrong?
What could possibly go wrong with putting someone who is still physically a man into the women's weightlifting category? And ironically, actually, the person who would have been chosen, if it wasn't for Laurel, the kind of second runner-up for the being chosen for the team, was somebody who was from an ethnic minority as well. So you have a whole racial issue there as well. That a white man who has decided to identify as a woman trumps a biological woman from a minority ethnic background. And it seems, look, every day there's news stories like this. What's going on? Can one of you perhaps try and give us a bit of background?
When you mentioned this, Andy, I was just thinking, could I identify as, an under 18 weightlifter? Although then I was thinking I would still lose. So maybe I could go for an under 11 weightlifter. Maybe that would give me a chance, possibly.
Yeah. Well, just on this issue alone, there was there's been a lot of media commentary, and someone made the point. Not trying to be funny, but just to sort of expose in one sense the ridiculousness, I guess, of this would be that if you were an able-bodied athlete and you decided you would identify as disabled, so you could come and compete in the Paralympics, and then you managed to beat everybody else because they were all disabled in some way, and there's you sort of fit and everything. Would people go, oh, that's fantastic, isn't it great that happened? Or would you be saying, well, hang on a moment, what on earth are you doing? Would the word cheating get thrown around? But obviously the Laurel Hubbard story is just the latest tip of a much bigger iceberg. I mean, what is going on? Why is the trans issue everywhere, it seems?
It's interesting that I've actually coined a term. I think I have. I don't know. I'd like to if I haven't. Satiriality, because I think the satire has become the reality. So we often are making these sort of jokes. We have been for years now. What a ridiculous thing! You've got those satire sites like Babylon Bee that sort of put out the kind of copious amounts of sort of satire material on various things that are going crazy in the West, and the transgender thing is one of those, or the way in which it tends to sort of eat itself alive and eat other agendas alive, which actually gave birth to it. So constantly we're seeing things that we joke about very quickly becoming reality, and then when they become reality, everyone's like, oh, that was never, can't even joke about it, that wasn't even a possibility. And so I think there's many people have commented on the fact that the speed at which this has gained prominence and traction is kind of astounding. I think people would usually tend to say that it's probably from around 2015 with the Caitlyn Jenner, formerly Bruce Jenner, former Olympic athlete, kind of coming forward. And I know we've all had a look at the Douglas Murray book, and he kind of comments on this as sort of where it almost just emerged out of nowhere, and a lot of media corporations jumped on it. Time magazine kind of front covers and things like this, where suddenly it became immediate that you had to get on board with this, and no one had really thought about it, but suddenly straight away they were like, you better be on board with it, it's the new civil rights agenda. So quite a few people were kind of amazed at this. Hang on, it was only like yesterday we didn't even talk about this at all, and suddenly we're saying that if you don't applaud this, there was a kind of American NFL player, was it, who didn't applaud for long enough at the kind of standing ovation for one of Bruce / Caitlyn Jenner's awards, and he sat down before everyone else and got lambasted for it. So how long are you supposed to, Douglas Murray points this out, how long you allow, what's the kind of appropriate amount of applause one should give someone gaining a kind of courage award in sport for having switched genders? So I think there's things here which we haven't even kind of caught up with the lack of reflection. I think I remember seeing Philip Schofield. Of course, we've mentioned him before for other reasons, but on one of the kind of morning TV shows here in the UK, really lambasting that Christian teacher. There's a Christian teacher who was, I think, lost his job, or maybe he was recovered in the end. I forget what he was certainly in trouble for accidentally kind of calling a table of girls. Now, girls, have you finished your maths exercise? And he got in massive trouble for that. And when he was defending himself on TV, saying, "Look, I'm a Christian. I believe God created people male and female. That's my right to be able to say that. I probably wouldn't use the term to them, to the girls or / boys in the class, just for the sake of avoiding trouble. But he said, I still believe that that's biologically a female." And then he was like, "I cannot believe what I'm hearing," is what Schofield says. Let's get, you belong in the medieval era. And you're like, come on, Philip Schofield, you didn't even care about this yesterday. And suddenly you're lambasting people for being completely backward for doing so. So I'll just quickly, just to kind of situate this, I'll read out Douglas Murray's kind of opening quote in his chapter on trans. I know we've read from this book a fair bit. There are other books available, but he's particularly incisive, I think. He says, "Among all the subjects in this book, The Madness of Crowds, and all the complex issues of our age, none is so radical in the confusion and assumptions it elicits, and so virulent in the demands it makes, as the subject of trans. There is no other issue that has so swiftly reached the stage whereby whole pages of newspapers are devoted to its latest developments, and where there is a never-ending demand, not just to change the language, but to make up the science around it." So I think it does really play into a lot of the stuff we've been discussing in other areas too.
Yeah, I think I'll come to you in a sec, Michael. I think one of the things that I found interesting about Douglas, and for folks who haven't come across Douglas Murray before, we have mentioned him on the show. He's interesting because Douglas is an atheist. He's also gay, so he really isn't coming from a conservative Christian position at all. But I think one of the things that Douglas talks about, both in the book and also on some of his live presentation I've seen, he said, what's interesting when we look back through history, invariably, pick any point in history and you can look at examples of where civilizations have done amazing things but have gone mad in particular areas. A good example would be slavery. You look back to, all that was going on in Britain, 300 or so kind of years ago, huge advances in technology and science and knowledge, exploration. The list goes on and on and on. Or the Greeks would be another example. Just look what they did with the classical world, all the stuff they did and built, and it's amazing. But they also believed it was perfectly okay to enslave another human being. And he said, we look back and go, they were literally bonkers. They were so far from reality there that you kind of you wonder what's going on. And then Douglas says, so what's the issue for us that future civilizations are going to look at and went, oh, God, man, those folks in the 21st century had so much. They had so much wealth and knowledge and the internet and digital technology and all kinds of stuff. And but when it comes to the issue of trans, they literally went mad because they got it into their heads that actually, despite the fact human beings are a sexually dimorphic species, it is perfectly okay for somebody to just on the whim identify as the other gender, and so be it. So I suppose a question, Michael, I wonder if you've got any wisdom to share here is, what has driven this? It's almost too easy to sit here and go, it's crazy. We're philosophers, we're thinkers. Douglas Murray and others are thinkers, and we're used to analysing ideas. It's quite easy to analyse this rapidly, and it falls to pieces. So why has it gained the cultural traction that it has, do you think?
Yeah, and I think this is quite interesting because if you listen to Douglas Murray, he will say basically there was this train of progression that pulled into the station somewhere in the mid-1990s, and everything kind of got wonderful, and we had equality of the sexes, and we had an end to racism and everything else. And then just at the moment where we'd reached utopia, almost, it kind of took off again, and now is kind of going crazy. And you kind of have to stop and say, well, did we pull into the station in the 1990s, or had things kind of come off the rails a bit before that? And I think when you look kind of in academia, actually you go back several decades before that in terms of the roots of what's happening now. This is simply the current manifestation of a bigger project, which has been happening in academia and then filtering down into culture, kind of ever since the sexual revolution. And the irony is, of course, that all the way along, when something happens, we say like, well, it's this, but that's crazy, that's ridiculous, we'll never get to that. But then give it 5 years and you do get to that, and as Aaron said, that becomes normalized, and then it's the next, and it's basically the deconstruction of society ultimately. So all of the things that traditionally that we would have said kind of systems that held society together and may have been good for the flourishing of society, we seek to deconstruct those things. And like, this is not the end of the road by any means. If we think that, yes, once we get to kind of equality for trans people, this project will finish, we're saying actually, no, not at all. There will be other things. Now, of course, whenever you say that, people go, don't be ridiculous, you're just scaremongering. But then actually experience shows that many of those prophecies, inverted commas, actually do come true.
Well, I think on the scaremongering piece, I've always thought a helpful way to sort of make people reflect on that, Michael, is to do a sort of little thought experiment. So imagine that you had a time machine. And imagine you were to, go back in time to the sort of 70s or 80s and talk to folks back then and say, well, in the 1990s and 2000s, gay rights is going to finally arrive and there'll be equal marriage and stuff. And back then you might have found people on the progressive end of politics who would just believe that, it's so exciting, because I'm not affirming it myself, but they would find that exciting and think, I can't just believe it. And then you would say to them, and then 10 years later, the whole trans thing's going to kick off. They would look at you and go, don't be ridiculous, because they couldn't see it. It was too far beyond their horizon of possibility. So to go, look, if those folks couldn't see it coming, goodness knows what we can't see coming. And I think in terms of beginning in the university, I think you're right. There's a great book that a lot of people have been reading of late called Cynical Theories by Helen Pluckrose and James Lindsay, really looking how a lot of these ideas began in the university. And they talk about the fact that in the 1960s, particularly postmodernism was everywhere in the universities, Derrida and Foucault and so forth, and other sort of thinkers. But it was very much in the realm of the mind and ideas. People talk about those as ideas and concepts, and they deconstructed texts. What we're now seeing is effectively applied postmodernism. Is people take it and go, well, let's actually apply this in the real world. And I guess my concern is the damage that does, particularly to women. Actually, we started with the story of Laurel Hubbard, and that's women's sport that's going to be drastically damaged. And then, Aaron, one of the things we were talking about before the show, is the impact this is having on young women. Right, another book recommendation. We'll put some of these into the show notes. There's an American journalist called Abigail Schreier, who wrote one of the most powerful books I've read for a long time, called Irreversible Damage. Picking up on the fact that if you look at below the stats of people who are transitioning, vast numbers of teenage girls. And she said there is something actually deeper going on with teenage girls, because a few generations ago, it was teenage girls who were, suffering eating disorders in massive amounts, so anorexia, bulimia. Then we had the self-harm phenomena. Again, teenage girls, primarily those who were self-harming. We had the whole satanic abuse and false memory sort of stuff that went on in the 90s. I remember that wave go through. Again, teenage girls. And now teenage girls are a big part of what's driving the transgender thing. And Abigail says there is something going on with teenage girls right now, that they are hurting so badly that, again, they're reaching out, in sort of psychic distress in this kind of way. What is going on there, Aaron? I mean, is she onto something, that there's an issue particularly around women and how transgender is affecting them, or connected in?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I hadn't heard the that connection till you mentioned it just before, about the kind of that connection between different kind of issues that have affected younger women. I see it as something that is connected to the narrative. Clearly, there is a sense of vulnerability that can affect women more, especially in our modern society. So when we've actually we've been sort of changing gender anyway. Feminism itself has been very, very powerful as a movement in loads of different ways. It has meant that men don't feel as comfortable to be men, and women don't feel as comfortable to be women. So even if you think of people like Germaine Greer, who was a kind of radical feminist in the 60s, who's now cancelled by the trans movement, and she's complaining, and you can see, it's really unfair, because how can they possibly be against Germaine Greer? She's kind of like an arch, Guardian writing liberal, but in a way, some of the moves of second wave feminism were influential upon trans without intending to be so. And so I think once you, mess with some of this stuff to the extent that our Western society has done, and I think it's a bigger issue to get into properly on this show, really, but it does have these kinds of effects. So it does mean that people at vulnerable stages of their life don't know how to be who they seem to be created to be. So I think it's not surprising that there'll be people at those vulnerable stages of life who will kind of reach out for something, for some kind of attention, or for some kind of radical transformation that might help them to be saved. It's almost like a kind of religious yearning for salvation. How can I live a life that really makes sense of me, and actually I can get to the heart of my identity? And the sad thing about identity politics is it serves them up this complete junk of a sort of remedy that will only keep asking for more. It's the same with any idolatry. It's kind of like, you often see this in sort of some of the pagan cults, or they still exist in various places of the world, but especially in the ancient world, where it was almost a dependency upon this idol, and I have to keep coming back and coming back and coming back. And there's no sense of assurance. There's no sense of identity. Of the same thing you get in Christian conversion, where you're kind of completely transformed and ongoingly sanctified. This kind of thing. We see a reversal of this, and a dependency upon things. So that's probably how I would see that issue. The other thing I'll just say briefly on it would be the narrative that is I'm particularly worried about here is relating to younger children. I mean, it's really, really quite scary. I was just from my office window early today. There's a nursery that's on the site where I am at the college I work at, and just seeing all these children walking across the field, doing a kind of little forest school thing. These are kind of 2-3-year-olds, just thinking, gosh, this is coming for them right now. I think they're okay. But these young, vulnerable, innocent children are already, by the time they get to primary school, this kind of rhetoric is already in the air. I'm dealing with it with my own children in primary school. Not that my children are thinking about this, but the fact that we're seeing the rhetoric coming in with some of their peers at primary school level, and we can see different initiatives coming into primary schools which will put pressure. And I mean, if parents think, oh, it will never get that bad, just you're kidding yourselves. It is going to get worse, and the pressure will get worse. Yeah. The stuff we've had on LGBT stuff is going to increase for primary school. And so we need to be really wary of children who are vulnerable, teenagers who are vulnerable, and how to protect them against some of this stuff.
And I think you're right that it's already coming in, because, this is a topic for another episode, no doubt. But, one of the reasons we as a family made the choice to homeschool, there were a few reasons, but was looking around, particularly here, Scotland is worse than England, if that's possible. On this, and going, schools are becoming ideological boot camps, and I am not really happy with my child being taught there are 150 genders, and that sexes, and so on and so forth, when quite frankly they need to be being just taught how to read and write. So that was one of the reasons for us. But sorry, Michael, you were going to chip in and say something there.
Just to say, because you asked kind of why this has gained traction, and we can look at it kind of in academia and how that's filtered down. But I think one of the things that's very interesting is one of the reasons why it's gained traction is it taps into this human desire for compassion. So it says, if you are going to be compassionate in our current age, you have to get behind this, because otherwise you are horrible, hateful, bigoted, so-and-sos. And you're on the same side as the Ku Klux Klan were in the 60s, basically. You were against the program, you hate people, and so on. And I think one of the things we really want to work on is, why do people go with something which, when you break it down and actually think about it, is saying some incredibly absurd things? And it's because we're told that is the way to be compassionate. And I think, therefore, one of the ways to respond to that is to say, well, actually, is this being compassionate? And one of the illustrations I often use is to say, well, if I'm dealing with a young person who is suffering with anorexia, and they say, I feel that I am fat and therefore I should not eat. Now, I don't endorse their feelings. I've got to challenge those feelings. It's the basic kind of thing in CBT, and that's an interesting thing, isn't it? Because as a society, generally, we recognise the value of CBT, challenging one's thoughts with objective truth. So surely in this area, we need to also challenge feelings with objective truth, not because we're being horrible and hateful, because we're being compassionate, because actually there's huge damage that's being done. And the book by Abigail Schreier is so horrific in the sense, because it's saying, like, we are doing stuff that is completely untested, that may have incredible long-term physical damage upon young girls particularly, and we're doing it all in the name of being compassionate, and we're being the opposite.
Yeah.
So I think we need to be careful. Like, we need to be careful in our language when we respond to this. Like, we're not responding to this because we hate people and we just want to have a philosophical argument. We're responding because actually we're really, really concerned for the well-being of people, and we think, this is not going to be for people's long-term flourishing and well-being.
Yeah. I think that's very helpful to ground it that way. And I think that, one of the things that's interested me around the trans discussion for a long while, actually, Michael, connects something that Aaron was saying, that, in some ways, that transgender ideology functions like a religion. Actually, I'm struck more and more by this. I mean, the idea that inside you, although that you may have the body of a man, inside you have the soul of a woman. So, God, that's a profoundly religious idea, that the real you is not material, but is this in a soul. And actually, there's some things there as Christians might want to say, well, actually, you might just be onto something, even though I'm not totally sure about the way you're expressing it. The other one that interests me, and what you described there, is that we've also built into the transgender movement, a very what in terms of religious ideas, one would call Gnosticism. And Gnosticism was that old, Greek idea from over 2,000 years ago, that what really kind of matters is the inner life of the mind and of feelings, and the world of matter and things and stuff is somehow second rate. And it's long fascinated me that if you've got somebody who is expressing some kind of gender dysphoria, that they've got the body of a male, but inside they somehow think they're a woman. Why our first move in today's culture be, well, okay, clearly what we need to do is give you lots of hormones and chop your bits off and try and change you that way. Whereas why not actually use counseling and talking therapies and see if we can explore why is there this tension, and let's see if we actually bring the mind into harmony with the body rather than wrench the body into harmony with the mind. So it fascinates me the way that these very old religious ideas are bubbling through the transgender movement.
And I don't know what you think of this, Aaron, but I wonder whether we've kind of shot ourselves in the foot a bit as Christians, because although you talk about Gnosticism as a kind of ancient idea, it's an idea that has been prevalent and infiltrating Christian theology ever since, which is this idea that what's really important is your soul. And so as Christians, we can kind of, in our preaching, in our talking, we can give the impression that your body doesn't really matter, whereas that's not a biblical idea. Our body really does matter. It is part of our identity, and it's part of discovering who we are. And we're not to kind of break it down in that kind of Greek way, just as the physical world matters because God created it and so on. And so actually in a positive way, one of the ways I discover my identity is actually by looking at the body I've been given. I have flat feet, so I'm rubbish at running. I'm never going to be an Olympic 100-meter runner, but I have,
unless you enter the under fives, of course.
Well, maybe in the under fives, but at the same time, I've got a high lung capacity and I've got quite good endurance. So long distance cycling and that kind of thing, I am good at, and that's become a big part of my life and so on. So it's just a kind of simple illustration of, rather than trying to conform my body to fit with what I feel I should be, I say, actually, what is the body I'm given? And then how is that going to affect the person I am going to become in different ways?
That's interesting. And just off the back of what both of you just said there, I was thinking especially of the Corinthian church in the New Testament, because I think what you described there, Michael, of the disembodied, perhaps disembodied evangelicalism, which I think is definitely true. I know you two are big NT Wright fans. I'm not so big of an NT Wright fan, but I agree with him in the sense that his big problem with contemporary evangelicalism has been this notion of a gospel where you are just a spirit that drifts off to heaven, and then nothing you do here really matters, which would include, of course, acts of the body and everything else, even if I think he goes a bit too far with the kind of eschatology he brings in, where it ends up becoming kind of middle class culture building is almost the gospel. But that's probably a bit unfair. But anyway, I do think he's onto something, and what you say there, the fact that we've peddled a gospel which does seem to give you no place to run or no place to go with your body and with your other pursuits. So you almost go to church for your spiritual fix, and then there's this thing like the coffee time afterwards is not the service and not really part of it. And I always found that weird. I found it when I used to run running a small group, or hosting a small group actually, where one of the elders of the church was actually leading the group. I think they might have been sussing my wife and I out about whether we could host one or not. And I remember we used to really enjoy having good times of banter with everyone, hosting them basically when they arrive, chatting away, getting into all sorts of different discussions back and forth. And then there'd always be a really awkward moment where this leader would come in and go, right, let's make a start. I was thinking, you don't think we've started? Like, do you don't think this is fellowship or community? No, let's make a start on like the actual thing, the real stuff that God cares about. Oh, okay, we were just sinning before, weren't we, by chatting? Whatever. I know it's a really weird thing that we've gotten into the habit of. Now, obviously, people have gone the other way, as with many things, but I do think we need to find a way to bring these things together. And I think the Corinthian church, as I mentioned, they had this problem of being these spiritual, had all these spiritual experiences. They love spiritual gifts. They're speaking out in tongues over one another. Paul's having to bring very specific things about church order there to this kind of almost uber charismatic sect in a way they could have become. But also they had this problem of sexual immorality. And those things are not coincidental, because it can be that when you become disembodied like that, you can think, oh, my body doesn't really matter as much. It doesn't matter if I have sex with people in these ways, or if I act in this particular way. So he really goes to town on sexual morality and on gender distinction. So 1 Corinthians is one of those has many tricky passages for people in the West today. And I think, this is part of the issue, I would say, that we've gone wrong. I mentioned Jermaine Greer earlier and the way that feminism has affected Western culture. I think the church has really followed very slowly, but still has followed the coattails of some of that. And now we find ourselves finding passages in places like 1 Corinthians and going, oh, I have literally no idea what to do with that. I'll just pretend it isn't there. Or I'll find a scholar to get me out of trouble, as we tend to do.
And just a book plug on that, Paula Gooder has written a book called Bodies. And that's actually really helpful in terms of looking at the theology behind the presenting issue. Just saying, actually, particularly looking at the writings of Paul and Paul's kind of theology of the body, which interestingly, actually, Pope John Paul did his major kind of work on. And if you want to read some Catholic on it, I think that's also, there's some really good stuff in there. But this idea of the theology of the body, is really helpful in terms of looking at what's the undergirding idea here, and where, when we've gone wrong, that's not helped others.
Yeah, I think it's some helpful thoughts in there. You mention of Corinthians, mention of the Bible. I suppose is a nice sort of segue maybe to the last sort of topic we get to explore around this in our kind of final 10 minutes or so. Is, it's very easy as Christians, right, to sit here and critique, particularly those of us who are thinkers, who read books or listen to podcasts or all this kind of stuff, and go, okay, well, obviously, transgender is wrong for all these reasons. That's my NT Wright voice. Kind of thing, because we can critique it philosophically and culturally and so on and so forth. But the fact of the matter is, there are people caught up in the transgender movement who are, although they may be kind of broken, messy, kind of individuals wrestling all these things, are made in God's image. And as the church, we want to be reaching those people. And I'm struck, of course, when you look at the Gospels, you look at Jesus, he didn't stand on the sidelines looking at the tax collectors and the prostitutes and the people who were, on the sort of fringe of society and go, well, I'm not going there. He went there, not to compromise, but to reach and to rescue. How as Christians and as the church can we take on that challenge? Because our friends in the transgender community need Jesus too.
Aaron, for our listeners, Aaron is raising his eyebrows in a way that says, Michael, you go first.
Michael, you're the evangelist here. Yeah, that's right.
Well, yes, exactly. Well, I'm an evangelist, but I'm in the
Aaron's just
I'm the caveat of evangelists. Yeah, I'll bring my caveat to you after you.
What's the collective noun for a group of evangelists?
A gaggle, or
a gaggle. I think an enthusiasm.
A waffle.
Just a waffle.
We're good at
one of my colleagues at Solas has coined this phrase that actually we quite like. We started using. He says that Christians should be sort of sort of hope mongers. You have fishmongers and ironmongers, and people who can't shut up about their wares. We should be people of hope. So maybe the collective term for a group of evangelists is a monger of evangelists. Right. But anyway, there's one evangelist to another. Michael.
Anyway, yes. I mean, I think, like you say, and this is why I mentioned it earlier, we need to be acting and speaking in compassion. I think it's helpful to say that. I think it's helpful to say that our concern here is not because we're wanting to be hateful and hurtful, but we want to speak with compassion. And we think that actually Jesus is God in Christ wants our flourishing, our goodness. He wants to give us life and so on. And therefore we want to challenge and correct error where we see it, where it's going to be harmful to people. Preston Sprinkle, to give you another book recommendation, Preston Sprinkle has written a really helpful book on it. And the name of it has just escaped me, but we'll put it in the show notes. And he's very helpful because actually, he's got lots of friends here in the trans community, and he obviously kind of ran the book by them. And although not all of them have agreed with everything, they were willing to kind of engage with it. And so if you want to kind of look at a book that is more pastoral rather than just theoretical, that's a really helpful book to go to. And he has a great line at the beginning. He says, if you've met one trans person, you've met one trans person. You've not met them all. We've talked earlier about the situation of particularly younger girls in Western culture, but there are all sorts of people in different stages of life who were born biologically male and female, who for different reasons have come to a point of becoming uncomfortable in their biological body. So he just says, don't extrapolate the one idea that you've once heard and think that everyone's doing this for the same reason. They're not. Let's have compassion. Let's listen to people's stories and so on. But at the same time, actually, we need to speak truth. And so he does come down to the conclusion that actually, yes, we need to learn how to live at peace in the biological body that we're given, rather than trying to conform that to our felt feeling of gender. I think one of the things that I find in kind of evangelistic talks when this comes up as a question that I find very helpful to talk about is to say, actually, one of the things that we want to do and have been trying to do as a society is to get away from some of the kind of Victorian, what might we say, preconceptions or stereotypes of gender, in terms of if you're a bloke, you have to do this, and if you're a woman, you have to do this. And that's been good. We've liberated ourselves. So, my wife can be an airline pilot, for instance. She's not constrained to just being a housewife or something like that. But at the same time, the irony, of course, of the transgender movement is it seems to be at times reinforcing gender stereotypes that we feel that we've been liberated from. So the moment that someone doesn't seem to kind of, represent or feel kind of historically masculine traits, they can't therefore be a male. And we want to say, actually, maybe the Bible can set us free. It's not to say the Bible doesn't have anything to say about what it means to be a man or a woman. But actually, if you read Proverbs 31, it's not a Victorian kind of culturally defined view of what a woman is. There's a whole load of feminine attributes there in Proverbs 31 that we might historically have associated with masculinity. So actually saying, we want to challenge that, I think that can be a helpful thing. There's lots more we can say as well, but it's probably enough for now.
Yeah, I think that's the book, by the way, I think is embodied transgender identities, the church, and what the Bible is saying. And I have to say, if you're a Christian who wants to write a book on transgender, having a name like Preston Sprinkle, I mean, Struth, that is just like a gift on a
That's amazing.
On a plate. When I first heard that name, I was like, really? That's amazing. I'd pay money
perfect name. Like that. Just to jump in off,
you jump in before I libel or something.
No, I think it's really helpful, and one of the things we need to focus on is looking out for the marginalized and not just sort of thinking we're going to be right. I mean, there's that Ben Shapiro line that's now on t-shirts called "Facts Don't Care About Your Feelings." Now, objectively speaking, I think it's actually a true thing when you're talking theoretically. And he was in a debate on trans on national television when he said that, when someone was saying, I feel this way. He said, no, you have certain chromosomes and they don't correlate to your feelings. So that's you don't get to change your gender based on your feelings. So that's why he said this famous phrase, facts don't care about your feelings. But if we're thinking pastorally, well, actually, the truth ought to care about your feelings, in the sense of the way that we handle the truth. How do you rightly handle the word of truth, as Paul would say to Timothy? And there's ways that Christians really need to think about those things. But at the same time, we've said many times on this show, we need to maintain our edge. So of course, the first thing we'll always say is, let's be pastoral. And by pastoral, like we said before, can often mean let's stroke and let's do the opposite of what you were saying earlier, Michael, like challenging some of these things as well. And you think of Jesus, he's speaking to certain different people in different ways. Who would be the Pharisees today? Who would be the people? Often we'll say, well, the Pharisee type people today would obviously be the anti-trans religious types. The people who are anti-trans, they must be the horrible Pharisees who are trying to, put constraints on people to stop them being who they're created to be, or something like this. But actually, I think it's the opposite. I think it's the LGBT lobby groups which are more likely the Pharisees, who are putting powerful agendas onto people's backs, and actually really silencing the voices of those who disagree. And like we've said before, vulnerable people are at stake here. This is a really big issue. This is a gospel issue in the sense that, do we care about liberating people? So it's a gospel issue in our proclamation to the world, being salt and light, helping these people. And of course, it's also a big deal within the church. We haven't really faced a huge thing of trans people within evangelical churches. It's been a big thing beyond evangelical churches for sure. But I think that's coming too, because it's, many of these things will eventually trickle in. And the one thing I'll quickly say, just probably in slight disagreement with Michael, not disagree, we don't really disagree on part of the gaps.
Fine.
Is I mean, I'm a big, I have a real sense that where we've gone wrong on lots of these issues and how to respond to them is because we've downplayed what the Bible says about masculinity and femininity. I don't think it raves about it epically, but I do think it's a huge theme all the way through. And we basically act like it's this thing in the background that doesn't really matter if you change it, because it's really embarrassing. The Bible is embarrassing on gender. And the proper scholars, as it were, inverted commas, which you can't see if you're listening to this, in the academy, the ones who really go to town on this, they end up saying stuff like Paul was a misogynist. So the evangelicals have to deal with that and go, okay, we clearly aren't allowed to think Paul is a misogynist. So how do we reconcile it? And then that's why you get NT Wright saying ludicrous things like Junior was an apostle and things like this, because they're trying to clutch at straws for how to create a situation where women can map onto the results of second and third wave feminism in the modern West. It's really obvious that that's what's happening. But I completely agree with you, Michael, that within that, there's also cultural stereotypes which can be demolished, and Scripture helps us do that. Women are massively important within Scripture, and men are in different ways, right? So they have different things to do, but they're not necessarily this kind of prudish, very straight-laced ideal. The Proverbs 31 woman is completely different to the 50s housewife thing that we often have in our minds. And yet at the same time, she's under the authority of her husband. So there are things there which are still embarrassing to what many of the kind of cool people things are for speaking today. So I think there's things there where if we can recover that, and I would say this to pastors, if you're dodging this issue, going, I don't want to get in trouble. Actually, I think the best way for you to, be a good voice of salt and light to your people and to people that you're trying to reach will be to emphasize these things. Because I think society needs to recover some of these things, because we're going mad. We're literally walking off a cliff. And so missionally speaking, I think recovering the embarrassing parts of gender and owning those and thinking how to interpret them responsibly, but actually saying, right, why did God create men and women complementarily, as it were? Why are they supposed to complement one another? That gets to the root of some of these issues theologically, how we can challenge transgender, I would say.
So if we haven't got ourselves cancelled talking about the transgender issue, Aaron has just achieved it by straying into this one. And
you can throw me off into a gap. You can say Aaron's in the gap.
That'll be a great podcast to do, though.
I think it would. I think we've got a podcast coming up on marriage. We perhaps also have one on masculinity and femininity, and this is great because I love it when we do actually get a debate going, because I'm somewhere between the two of you on this. Not least that I do think Junior was an apostle, but that's a discussion for another time. Where I'd love to bring it into land, because we are coming up to the 45-minute mark, is one of the things that I think struck me in a lot of the transgender stuff is how I think there is a lot of brokenness underneath society and lives that I think people's grasping for the transgender thing has been an attempt to hide. And I remember reading a really interesting reflection somebody wrote on the whole, where we started actually with Bruce Jenner and Caitlyn Jenner, where perhaps all this kind of kicked off. That very famous cover, I think it was Vanity Fair magazine, wasn't it, where Caitlyn, the newly titled Caitlyn Jenner, was there, dressed interestingly not as a 50-year-old woman, but as a 25-year-old woman. It's interesting that Bruce had changed age as well as gender. But somebody pointed out, it's very interesting. If you go and look at that photograph, you can find it on Google image search, really easy to find. Very interesting to see what is not in shot. The fact that Bruce Jenner's hands, Caitlyn Jenner's hands, are not in shot. They're behind her back if you look at the photograph. And the reason for that, I believe I've read the story that the photographer was asked about that, and he simply commented, well, he couldn't find a way of making her hands look feminine. Bruce has these great big dinner plates, very obviously masculine hands, and so they're hidden. And I read a very fascinating reflection on this from a gospel perspective, saying, is it interesting that all of us have something that, try as we might, we cannot hide. We have brokenness and stuff that we're embarrassed about in our lives and our character and identity. And even with, all the kind of transitioning in the world, we can't quite hide. But the interesting thing is God sees it anyway. God can see those hands, and Christ still died for Caitlyn Jenner, and the gospel invitation for her to come to Christ and have the brokenness properly dealt with still stands. And as Christians, how can we reach out to people and say, look, we may disagree with you on some things, but we are not going to judge you. We want to welcome you in spite of your brokenness, because that's the gospel come invitation. And it was a beautiful way of preaching that message through that picture. Well, we have touched on all kinds of issues for another time if we don't get ourselves cancelled. There's a running gag that we're going to get cancelled. I don't think we're going to get cancelled. I think we're not edgy. We need to get more edgy. We need to start.
We do have a Twitter handle though, so
yes,
that will.
Oh yes, we do. Yes,
the real
exactly.
one. I got the wrong. I posted to the wrong one.
I basically discovered how to create your own Twitter handle. I didn't realize you could change it. Now we are Pod on the Gaps.
Yes, I realised I was about to say we now do have a Twitter handle, and it came out of my mouth a moment ago as we new do, which is maybe a Scottish word for we new do. So we now do have a proper functioning Twitter handle and probably about 3 followers, but we are going to start kind of using it. So if you are on Twitter, I know that all that Twitters is not gold, but many of you are on Twitter. Thank you for the 3 listeners who laughed at that joke. Michael, with a drum roll, please. What is the official Pod of the Gaps Twitter handle?
We are at Pod of the Gaps.
You must have been up all night thinking.
I know. I really wrestled with various options, but that's it. It's all lowercase, no underscores, no capital letters. Although I don't think capital letters makes a difference in Twitter, does it?
It's amazing that earlier, because you were like, I've gone for Gaps Pod originally, and then me and Andy were like, why not Pod of the Gaps? The name of the podcast.
So anyway, if you are on Twitter, check us out on at Pod of the Gaps. If you're on Facebook, you can look up Pod of the Gaps. We're there as well. We post all the new shows. If you enjoy Pod of the Gaps and would love us to continue, do perhaps consider supporting the show. We are a listener-supported show. I think that's the phrase these days. In the show notes for this show, you'll find a link to our Patreon channel. If you like what we do, chip in £1 or £2 a month. It all makes a difference with all various costs. Not many, but the costs that do go into producing this. And other than that, it just falls to me to say thank you to Michael and Aaron for their contributions. We hope you've enjoyed listening to this on your run, on a walk, in the car, making sourdough, whatever you're doing, where you catch your podcast. And we'll be back with another exciting episode and another entirely non-controversial topic in a week or 10 days' time. So on behalf of the 3 of us, bye for now.